So continuing with evolution, here's an old article, Evolution of Body Size in a Wood Rat. Here's a way that your abstract is going to be different from these kinds of abstracts. Is that there are certain forms in different scientific publications, like, you know, they describe how they did their research and they put stuff up there, is that you need to put that in your abstract. It wouldn't necessarily be in the abstract for the article because everybody kind of expects the articles to follow some variations in the basic form. But here, this is not really an abstract of the article. This is a summary of their conclusions, their findings, and that's fairly common. They found that they got smaller as things got warmer, which is, you know, a bit shorter than what they put up here. Now, sometimes you'll hear people criticize evolution by talking about things that Darwin believed that aren't true. Well, it was 150 years ago. Of course, there's things that Darwin believed that aren't true, is that that's the way science works. But one of the things that kind of held back evolutionary theory for quite a while was uniformitarianism, is that nobody really looked around and saw fast changes in living things. And so any kind of change would have had to have been gradual. And you can't always come up with a good explanation for a gradual change. Also, you look at the relationship between reptiles and birds, what we now think of as between dinosaurs and birds, and how do you get from scales to feathers? The idea of Darwinian evolution is that that progression required the proto-feathers to have an advantage between the scale form and the feather form. Now, we actually now know that the feathers were almost certainly a combination of display and insulation before some of them were modified for support surfaces for flying or gliding. But there were situations where dramatic changes would have been necessary in a form in order for survival to be actually selected for. And nobody knew how that worked because nobody knew about mutations. Nobody knew about how sometimes you can get a fairly dramatic change in members of a population that become survival advantages. Basic Darwinian evolution is what they call descent with modification. New traits are built on existing ones. It's kind of like Bayesian in its scope. They coined a term called vestigial. Now, this is just human beings. They would have told you that your appendix is vestigial. What does that mean? Well, it isn't. It's kind of what's left over of a part that used to be useful, but there's no use for it anymore. Is that almost every time that people have said that, what it amounts to is we can't figure out what it's doing, so it must not be doing anything. Eventually somebody figures out, no, there's a reason why it's there. And now the term vestigial is been shifted over to, you're looking at a structure and its purpose is significantly different from what the old purpose used to be. Is that your appendix wasn't really a cecum, but a cecum was a fermentation pouch. And it looks like our appendix is a kind of a little closet that we hold on to, hold a sample of microbiome in, so that if we get a disease that wipes through us, diarrheal diseases do that, and there's a lot of them, that we can repopulate our microbiome from this little side closet. But it's not there for no reason. Oh, when I was a kid, they didn't think that your tonsils did anything. That's why it was, you know, most of the people from my generation don't have at least their throat tonsils. Because, you know, if you had problems with them, they just rip them out. They go, they're not doing you any good. They're a functional part of your immune system. We will get into what's called the modern synthesis later, where genetics gets pulled into evolution. And And then you see things like genetic drift, where things are not necessarily selected for, but you get different mutations in related populations. And you will see the nature of the average individual kind of drift away from one another if you get reproductive isolation. This is all stuff that's more integratable when we've done genetics. So we'll talk about that later. When Haeckel was able to show the development of embryos and then compare embryo development in different related but distantly related species and find huge similarities early on, that was a way of supporting the idea of shared ancestors. And if you think about it, it also supports Darwinian evolution, is that embryos develop in very similar conditions. Inside of an egg, it's very similar across a wide breadth of eggs. And of course, what they're doing is very important because it's forming things that are going to be used later. And so tinkering is not usually a great thing to do. So you'll see, our embryos and a fish embryos and a bird's embryos, and for a while they all look essentially the same. I taught embryology for years, and if you give me an embryo early enough, I could probably tell the difference between a reptile and a fish. Well, a fish, but a bird and a mammal. As they get older, the obvious differences start to arise. But it links groups by linking something about them that hasn't really been that selected for. So it stayed the same. You also get the idea of living fossils, like horseshoe crabs. Those almost always involve forms that when you look at them in the fossil record, they look very similar to what exists today. And if you look at their niche, they tend to exist in an ecological niche that has been incredibly stable over millions and millions and millions of years. They produced a form that was really good at working in that niche. They stayed in that niche. The niche has persisted. Open water sharks, horseshoe crabs in the surf zone, and they haven't changed. Well, they have. They actually have evolved not to evolve, is that they have come up with a form so successful that they are resistant to mutational change in a way that most other organisms are not. And of course, there's been a lot of experimental support and a lot of observational support in nature. I just read an article in the last month about how there's a Chinese medicinal plant that the natural plants, if you go out looking for them now, the plants themselves the population has gone from being a green plant to a grayish plant. The grayish plant, it lives kind of up on the sides of mountains amongst the rocks, and it is much harder to find when it's gray than when it was green. So they probably have given up some photosynthetic abilities in order to not get picked. The grayer ones were missed, the green ones were picked. The gray ones survived to reproduce, and now you're looking at a population of plants that is distinctly grayer than it used to be. And at some point, maybe different enough to be considered a different species. Remember, species is just our labeling anyway. Here's a situation where if you introduce artificially introduced predators into a situation, what you will see is compare two populations in essentially similar conditions, and then you change the conditions in one. Over time, you will see a change in that population's average individual. In this case, these pikes, big fish, tend to prey on decently sized fish. And what you find over time is the guppies that reproduce before they get big enough to interest the pikes are the survivors and the reproducers, sexual and natural selection. And what you wind up with is eventually a population of smaller guppies. So they're kind of evading, I'm assuming they keep growing and then the pikes eat them, but if they've already reproduced, then you can change the population that way. What we're seeing in the world now is strains of coronavirus. And you're seeing selection for a couple of features. is if you get a strain that is, for one reason or another, more contagious. It may generate faster, so it generates a viral load that can be spread quicker than the other ones do. It may get into the next host more effectively than the other strains. There's a couple of, remember, the features that are advantageous are not always the same features. And the worry now is that there are going to be strains that can evade immune responses. Why? Well, occasionally you get people that have gotten COVID, and because their immune system is not fully functional, they've been sick for a really, really long time. So their immune system has been working against the virus. They never got sick enough for it to really threaten their lives, but they were sick for months and months and months. And so they have been selecting viruses that are more and more successful at evading immune responses. And people worry that once those get out into other people, that your basic immune response isn't going to work anymore. One of the problems with the vaccines that we're using is that the vaccines are exposing us to one single antigen on the virus. And so, whereas now I had COVID, I don't have just one single antigen to one surface protein on COVID. I've got an array of antigens, and also my system fiddles with them in order to shift antibodies against potentially new strains. I mean, if you've been vaccinated, the same thing may be true, but you're only getting one protein, one antigen in the vaccine. And if that particular antigen shifts in a way where it's still an effective invader, but your antibodies don't attach to it well, then the vaccine isn't effective anymore. It's not producing the right kind of immunity. Now, there's a link in the book to a page that I wrote a number of years ago on the evolution of childhood diseases, which I think I'm looking at what I got here. Yeah, I'll slip it in here. Now, some of this is almost certainly in play in the age of COVID, but nobody talks about it. I'll explain why in a minute. In human situations where the civilization has risen to the point where there's pockets of population, cities, decent-sized cities that are in a network relatively close together, you get a breeding ground for certain types of diseases. Diseases are caused by living things. They evolve. The population they affect evolves. Almost certainly, the first step is that some strain of animal pathogen is capable of living and affecting a human being and then spreading to other humans. As every once in a while we get a bird flu that infects people that work around birds, but they don't spread it to other people. That's not a successful jump from birds to humans in that case. In our case, it looks like it came from bats, went to humans. This strain was capable of working in humans and spreading to other humans. But there's a long history of this, of different flus and other sorts of things in Europe and Asia, and possibly Mesoamerica before the Europeans got there. That may be why they were in trouble when the Europeans got there. They may have been dealing with essentially a pandemic, at least a local pandemic. It's widespread. So somebody brings this pathogen into a city and they spread it. It's not great at living in people. It makes them really sick. It kills a bunch of them. But you're now getting evolution at work. Some people are more resistant to the effects and the chemistry of the pathogen. Those are going to be your survivors. Those features are probably things they can pass on to their offspring. So you're immediately weeding through the host population for people that can survive this. There is a suggestion that that may be true for some populations for coronaviruses. Some populations have suffered very little from the coronavirus. And it may be exposure to related viruses in the past, or it may be natural resistance in that particular population. The powers that be are very resistant to offering that as an explanation, because they don't like to suggest that human populations are different from one another. You know, yeah, there's differences that you can see. We can't really do much of anything about that except tell you that people are basically all the same, and genetically we are pretty much all the same, but it doesn't mean we're really all the same. There are differences, and some of those differences have to do with abilities to deal with certain types of pathogens. You may be a population that's dealt with a similar pathogen in the past, and it's sorted through for certain resistance traits. But that's what happens. This pathogen gets into the city, and it makes a bunch of people sick, and it kills a bunch of people. That's sorting through the population of hosts. But also, there's competition for the offspring of the pathogen to get out of a host and into the next one, because that's how pathogens work. They got to spread, because living in you until you die isn't doing them any good. They got to reproduce, get it out. Well, the ones that are more effective at that are going to change the average nature of the pathogen population. Well, what makes you successful? Are you successful if you make your host really sick and kill them really fast? No, you're really not that successful, because you're not going to spread very far. So the pathogen population tends to evolve toward more mild disease, what they call less virulence. And so very quickly the hosts are sorting through, you're developing a resistant population in the hosts, and the pathogens, because they reproduce much faster, are often developing toward a milder version, which you kind of need because you need it to get carried to the next city. Eventually, the pathogens' hosts develop immunities, they develop antibodies. They're no longer infectable. And so this is what we call herd immunity. When we get enough people that are immune, it's hard for the pathogens to spread. It's hard for them to find potential hosts spreading from current hosts. Typically, we hit that with vaccinations. But the fact of moving it from city to city, it's really hard to hit herd immunity in a widespread scale, and it always has been. So the pathogen is carried by somebody who's at least ambulatory enough to get to the next city. Maybe they ride in a car, maybe they're capable of walking, but it needs to get into the next city. It's still going to affect a lot of people badly, because it may be less virulent, but there's also going to be people in the new city that don't deal with it well. So you're going to get another wave of serious disease and potentially death. And then it's going to lead to the next city and the next city. If it tries to come back to the original city, then there aren't enough susceptible people to support it, unless it takes a few years. If you have a huge network of cities, it goes to here, comes back, nope, not enough potential hosts, dies out there. Here, comes back, not enough potential hosts. Here, comes back. Oh, okay. Now there's enough potential hosts to support a new outbreak of disease. And who are those hosts? The people that weren't born when it came through the first time. These are the kids. Now, you're not born with immunity, you're born with resistance. This is a resistant population. It has the capability of dealing with this pathogen, but it's kids. The kids are biologically different than adults. So you may see a nasty wave of disease, but now the disease has to work out a loss of virulence, not in every human, but just in the kids, in order to persist itself. And it gets spread to the kids, to the kids, to the kids. And what you wind up with eventually is a disease that is primarily a disease of children, because most of the adults had it as kids, so they're immune, and the children are the available population. And long term, very often these diseases do not do well in adults anymore, is that they're well adapted to living in children, but if you get measles as an adult, it's much more serious. If you get chickenpox as an adult, or mumps, it's a much more serious disease in an adult than it is in a kid, because the pathogens are adapted to the kids. But you do wind up with a resistant population. And of course, during the age of exploration, these diseases would get on ships. It would pass through the crew as they went across the ocean, but the crew was largely resistant, so they got sick, but it didn't kill them very often. But they still, as it worked its way through the crew, there were still infective people when they hit land on the other side of the ocean. And now they're up against what's called a naive population, a population that had never been exposed to this pathogen at all. And you get this wave again. You get this, the Pilgrims were able to actually settle in New England because the Native American population they were dealing with had been decimated by some disease that had been brought earlier. And because they had been decimated, they kind of needed the support of the British and their weapons in order to keep the neighboring Native American tribes from finishing the job and wiping them out. So this is how not just diseases evolve, but in that case, childhood diseases. So you see it's two populations selecting features that make them successful under those conditions and then persisting over time. And that brings us to the idea of evolutionary rates. Evolution is driven by changes in conditions. Conditions change quickly, you're going to see faster evolution. It's selecting differences much more quickly if conditions change rapidly. But also, like you see in the diseases, if you reproduce quickly, if you're generating new offspring really fast, that potentially can change your population faster than something that reproduces slowly. So very often things that reproduce very slowly are more individually adaptable. They've got more adaptable flexibility kind of built into their systems so that they can deal with condition changes that they are not going to deal with by turnover. Where something that turns over very rapidly can change the population, change the population, change the population. And eventually there was a long argument for a long time of whether evolution was always gradual or whether it happened in spurts. Because the fossil record suggests that it's very stable and then it changes, and it's very stable and it changes. Well, the fossil record tends to go from mass extinction to mass extinction, where conditions change very rapidly, sort out a whole bunch of new species adapted to the new conditions, and so you see a whole bunch of things go extinct because you don't always adapt. Sometimes you just die out. And but it's a misnomer to say, is it gradual or is it punctuated? It matches the change in conditions. It matches the capability of the individual organisms. In terms of evolution out in the wide world, obviously there's a lot of religions that are taught that that man was formed as we are, that we were, these perfect beings. I don't think anybody who ever intently studies anatomy and physiology would believe that. There's, in evolution, you don't get what makes sense, you get what you get. And sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense, it just works. Moving sperm production outside of the body just so you could keep it at the optimum temperature for sperm production, as opposed to birds, which eventually evolved enzymes that worked at internal body temperatures. If you were going to sort through those and go, which one makes sense, you'd probably go with the birds and not with the mammals. But it has a lot to do with what you think the past exists as. Has the world always been the way that it is, or not? And the idea that there's a controversy, there's no controversy. There's people go, oh, there's disagreement. Well, there's disagreement on the mechanisms of what drives evolution. Is this more effective than that? Is it mutation? Is it epigenetics, which is a new one? Is it purely selecting? There's a whole bunch of little bits and pieces, but nobody in biology questions the basic process. Is it happens all the time? You see it happening all the time. Natural selection is just the way that it works. Okay, that's the evolution chapter.